Shalom, everybody, here for the Israel 365 book interviews with our author, Michael Oren, Ambassador Michael Oren. It's great to have you, Ambassador Oren.
Good to be with you. Shalom.
Shalom. So it's amazing how accomplished you are. You're so well known and beloved here in Israel as a historian, as a diplomat, as the former ambassador, and now you are also you're a fiction writer. You just came out with a new book of fiction, short stories, called The Night Archer and Other Stories. And
Here it is.
Oh, it's upside down.
I can turn it upside down. How about that one? Talk about being dyslexic, huh?
So everybody could get it on Amazon, of course, and Barnes and Nobles. So, you know, we work with Christians, and a lot of our viewers today are non-Jews who love Israel, and I'm always encouraging them to study the history of Israel. If you want to really understand the Jewish people, you have to understand our history. And you, of course, have written many books of history, and I'm sure so many of our readers have read your book on the Six-Day War, or your book about the Power, Faith, and Fantasy and America's relationship with Israel and the Middle East from 1776. But what would you say about non-Jews reading Jewish fiction? Is that as worthwhile? What would you say about that?
Well, much of my fiction deals with the question of faith. I'm a person of faith. What's less known about my career is that I served as the advisor on church affairs for Yitzhak Rabin. I know every church in this country and every church movement and every sect in this country. I know my New Testament very, very well, to quote it even, and find it to be a very Jewish book for the most part, with Jewish prayers and Hebrew, you know, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And that's my language. And so very close to that. So there are stories in this collection, in The Night Archer, which deal with faith, which deal with God, which deal with Satan, with evil, with the nature of the human soul. There's one, I think, very powerful story. It's interesting. It's a story that's been very popular among my Orthodox Jewish readership. It's a story about a pastor in a church he and his family are grappling with a deep moral question. And it raises serious questions about whether morality can be impacted by current events and the degree to which it is malleable, can change over time. So there's much to find in these stories, even though it is by a Jewish press, by a Jewish author, but it's by a Jewish author who has a deep sensibility about Christianity, deep knowledge about Christianity, and has interacted with Christians across the field, but especially with the evangelical community.
That's great. That's great. And I think that, you know, I've read some of what you've said about the liberation of writing, and specifically writing fiction. Can you explain maybe why you're interested, or why fiction and short stories is often a more unique or even a better way of communicating your ideas?
Well, it's in fiction, certainly in short fiction, you can be anybody, anything, anywhere, anytime you want to be. I find it to be a particular Jewish form. Your viewers who know the Bible well will know that, you know, we, the Jewish people, don't have a particularly rich artistic legacy. I mean, the only thing that we made on our own initiative, without being told to be made by God, was the golden calf. And that didn't turn out so good. Otherwise, God told us how to build a tabernacle, how to build a temple, you know, down to this most minute detail. But we did the golden calf, didn't turn out so good. We know there are many musical instruments mentioned in the Bible and song mentioned in the Bible. We don't know what they look like. We don't know what they sounded like. But we do have is fiction. We do have literature. And we have stories, mostly short stories. The Bible is a collection of short stories. Even the New Testament is a collection of relatively short fiction. And what is wonderful about short fiction is the discipline of it. Is that, you know, what a novelist can do in 300 pages, a short fiction writer has to do in 3 pages or less. Most of my stories are about 3 pages and less. And so it's a tremendous discipline. And to me, this is something inherently faith-based. Why? Because the Bible has a message about freedom. And we in Hebrew have many words for freedom, whether it's chofesh and cherut and atzmaut and drol, many words, beautiful words in Hebrew for freedom. But freedom in the Jewish tradition always comes with limitations. In other words, you can be liberated from slavery in Egypt, right? But then you're going to go to Sinai and get the law. So you have freedom and law. And true freedom can never be free unless it comes within the context of laws. Otherwise, it's just chaos. It's anarchy.
Mm.
True?
Yeah.
It's not the freedom of the 60s, right? It's a different freedom. And that is that faith-based freedom. And it was that reason why the founding fathers and mothers of the United States of America internalized that notion of freedom in the Constitution. So in order to make Americans truly free under the Constitution, you had to bound them with law, with checks and balances. It's a very biblical text, the Constitution.
Right.
So a short story also comes out of that school of freedom. On one hand, total freedom. Okay, I can be a conquistador in the 1500s, and I can be a sultan in the 1700s, and I can be a waste governor and a B-17 bomber in World War II. But all of those assertions of freedom come with tremendous discipline and restraint. And that's what makes it Jewish.
The discipline and restraint on the author?
Sure. Because again, you have those 3 pages, you have to develop character, plot, dialogue, drama. I weigh every word has to be considered 20 times.
So in many ways it is like, the Bible, because you mentioned how the Bible has been an influence on you as a person of faith. How else has the Bible influenced? Obviously every word in the Bible is so precious and eternal.
Sure. The Bible's the ultimate discipline.
Right.
And the Bible has poetry, the Bible has verse, the Bible has meter, and the Bible has stories.
Right, absolutely. And teaching your children the stories of Judaism is such a part of our religion. And so many of our holidays are not only revolved around, I guess, Passover revolves around not only freedom, but the telling of stories.
But keep in mind, we're probably the only people in the world who has a holiday that's dedicated to freedom. But what do we do in that holiday? We have more laws. We have more restrictions on that holiday. There is the paradox. In the introduction to this book, I tell a story about a friend of mine I grew up with who was a very assimilated Jew. He didn't like being Jewish, and I used to deny it. And he became a very well-known Hollywood producer, actor, director. He came to visit me in Israel. And I took him to my synagogue, and it was the holiday of Simchat Torah, where we celebrate the giving of the Torah, the completion of the Torah. And my friend was watching as people were dancing around with the Torah scrolls and celebrating. And he turned to me and said, wait a minute, I don't get it. These people are celebrating and dancing for a book that tells them all the things that they cannot do. And he couldn't wrap his mind around that paradox, that contradiction. And he got more and more interested. And today, that same former Hollywood producer director is an Orthodox Jew.
Wow. Yeah, it's very fascinating because, you mentioned the connection between the holiday of Passover and the freedom and the restrictions. And it's also the most celebrated of all of the Jewish holidays, as opposed to, we have a holiday without any restrictions. Shavuot has no restrictions whatsoever. And that's probably the one that's the least embraced by the community.
Fascinating. No, who doesn't love Passover?
Right, absolutely. So the paradox of freedom is something, does that come up in your stories as well?
I think it's hardwired into my stories. We're living in a certain very difficult time in history, and a very difficult time for artists and writers who are expected to write less and less. If you are a certain race or religion or even sexual orientation, you have to write exactly about who you are, lest you be accused of being culturally, appropriating, right? Even racist. And so I view my book as sort of an assertion of freedom. I refuse to be told what I can't write about. I refuse. And maybe I'll get excoriated for it. Maybe I won't. But this is my freedom.
I know that our viewers would be interested in the other stories that have a biblical focus or a biblical theme. Are there any other stories that you could tell us about?
I'm fascinated by biblical stories. So I have a story in this collection about a conversation that takes place the day after creation. The story is called Day 8. It's a conversation between God and Satan. about whether to give human beings a soul, whether to make them moral beings. And it's an interesting conversation because Satan is up to, satanic things. And he knows that if men and women get souls, then they can be open to being corrupted and be led down the course of evil. And the question is whether God's onto Satan. So that is a very faith-driven story. I have stories about Judaism, about Orthodox Judaism, stories about Reform Judaism. And as I mentioned, there's stories about Christian communities too. I feel very strongly about it.
So if I could just, in the last question, shift our focus, is that all right? And ask you about current events and politics?
All those, yes.
So as the former ambassador of Israel to the United States, it seems like we're living in really interesting times with the recent peace treaty between Israel, or the normalization with the UAE, but also very critical times, especially as America heads towards an election. And what I think was surprising to many people, many of your followers, was how after you left Washington, you came out pretty strong against the Obama administration with an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about how Obama abandoned Israel, and talking after President Trump was here in 2017, you talked about how his love for Israel and the Jewish people was so palpable. You mentioned that in one of your talks. So I'm wondering how you feel about, the election going as we get closer. Are you nervous about the outcome of the election? Because it seems like Israel has become a very dicey issue.
It has indeed. Whatever happened to bipartisan support? I'll be very frank with you. I know former Vice President Biden very well. I know former Senator Harris very well. Both of them are pro-Israel. Both of them are committed to the U.S.-Israel strategic alliance. They will not use U.S. aid as a way of sort of arm twisting Israel. But the fact is we have policy differences with them. We'll have policy differences over the Palestinian issue. They will probably reject the Trump peace plan, which I think is the best peace plan we've ever seen. And I've been in this game, as you know, for 30 years. They will probably restore U.S. aid to Palestinian, pardon me? They'll probably restore U.S. aid to UNRWA and other corrupt Palestinian agencies. Mm-hmm. They will probably not move the embassy back, but we're going to have problems on the Palestinian issue and on the settlement issue. They'll oppose Israel's building in Judea and Samaria and in Jerusalem. The biggest policy difference, though, will be about Iran. And both Biden and Senator Harris have come out and said that they will restore the U.S. agreement with Iran, the nuclear deal, which we view as a strategic threat, as a threat to my children and grandchildren. And that's a very serious difference between us. So without getting involved in the U.S. elections, I would exhort and beseech the Democrats not to renew that agreement and not to forfeit the great progress that has been made on the peace front by not focusing on settlements and not focusing on the Palestinians. To take if they win, if the Democrats win in November, I don't know, I'm not a prophet, I'm a historian, I have problems predicting the past. I would urge them to take the diplomatic equivalent of the oath that doctors take, the Hippocratic Oath, and say, first of all, do no harm. Right. Do not bring the United States back into that nuclear agreement. Do not jettison the Trump peace plan. Do not try to interfere with the growing relationship between Israel and the Arab world. Okay. Well, thank you, Ambassador Oren. And once again, it's The Night Archer and Other Stories available on Amazon. Holding it up right this time. And Barnes & Nobles. Thank you very much. Thank you. Shalom. Be well. Let's go.